General Hospital spoilers for Friday, July 18 reveal that Anna had reached a boiling point. And her confrontation with Carly was not just a moment of anger, it was the eruption of a long simmering storm. 4 weeks. She had been tracing unauthorized data leaks and encrypted communications that led directly back to Port Charles. But what she hadn't anticipated was that Jocelyn, someone she had once viewed as relatively removed from the dangerous world of espionage, would be at the center of it. Anna's world had always been defined by structure, hierarchy, and control. The WSB was built on discipline, and any breach of protocol was treated as a serious offense. Now, those carefully drawn lines had been blurred by a young woman who didn't understand the gravity of the game she was playing. And standing between Anna and the truth was Carly. Full of fury and protective denial, unwilling to believe her daughter could be involved in something so volatile. The confrontation began with cold precision. But emotion quickly overtook Anna's professional restraint. Jocelyn hadn't just stumbled into WSB territory, she had been actively corresponding with someone deep inside a shadow cell, possibly Vaughn. Possibly someone more dangerous. Anna had found coded messages traced to Jocelyn's devices, evidence of surveillance files downloaded without authorization, and worst of all, signs that she had interfered with the extraction of a WSB informant. Carly, when first told of these findings, assumed it was all a mistake. But the more Anna revealed, the harder it became to refute. Jocelyn had hacked into secure systems, bypassed firewalls designed by some of the top minds in international intelligence, and left digital fingerprints all over confidential WSB operations. Carly's rage quickly shifted from indignation to disbelief. Her daughter, her Jocelyn, couldn't have gone so far. But the evidence was irrefutable. Anna laid out the timeline, the server access logs, the intercepted messages signed under Jocelyn's personal encryption key. It wasn't just a teenage misstep or an impulsive act of curiosity. This was strategic, calculated, and frighteningly well executed. Carly's maternal instincts began to erode under the crushing weight of the truth. As the room closed in, Anna pushed harder. This wasn't just about what Jocelyn had done, it was about who else might now be in danger because of it. The WSB had enemies. So did Sunny. And now Jocelyn, by inserting herself into the operations of both, had made herself a target. Anna believed Jocelyn may have even inadvertently aided Vaughn in securing sensitive information about Port Charles's most powerful figures. The names of allies, the locations of safe houses, and even Jason's recent movements had all been compromised. Carly, once so confident in shielding her family from the darkness surrounding Sunny's world, now realized she had failed to protect Jocelyn from the allure of that very darkness. Jocelyn had seen too much, learned too fast, and acted too recklessly. The weight of betrayal settled on Carly's shoulders as she processed the fact that her daughter may have jeopardized not only the safety of their inner circle, but also the strategic infrastructure of the WSB. Anna was relentless. Her frustration wasn't just rooted in protocol, it was personal. She had watched too many young people fall into the abyss of espionage without understanding the cost. Jocelyn's bravado, her need to emulate the power and influence around her, had placed her in the center of an international storm, and now there was no way to quietly walk it back. Anna demanded cooperation. She needed access to every device Jocelyn had used, every message sent, every connection made. Carly hesitated, still torn between loyalty to her daughter and the knowledge that this was spiraling beyond anything she could contain. The trust between her and Anna fractured under the pressure of conflicting duties, one to motherhood, the other to national security. But beneath all the anger and shock was a growing terror. If Jocelyn had helped facilitate a breach in WSB intelligence, it was only a matter of time before retaliation followed. Port Charles had seen its share of threats, but this was different. This wasn't a local mob war or a personal vendetta. This was the WSB, and the consequences would be global. Anna feared that the repercussions might already be in motion, that enemies of the Bureau were mobilizing, emboldened by the breach. Worse, Anna believed that Jocelyn might not be the only one involved. If someone had manipulated her, used her access and ambition to open a doorway into the bureau, then the threat was far greater than anyone imagined. Carly, once the pillar of strength in any crisis, felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She had faced kidnappings, deaths, betrayals, but nothing prepared her for this. Her daughter had stepped into a world ruled by secrets and shadows, and now they were all at risk. As Anna left, the tension hung heavy in the air. A thick fog of uncertainty and fear. Carly was left alone with the truth, the knowledge that Jocelyn's choices had opened a door that might never be closed. Anna's warning echoed in her mind. This isn't just about Jocelyn, it's about what happens when people play in the shadows without understanding the monsters that live there. And now, those monsters were coming. Portia had reached a breaking point. For weeks, she had been pulled into a web of secrecy, manipulation, and ethical compromise that threatened to shatter everything she believed in. Drew had cornered her with pressure so sharp it felt like a scalpel slicing through her integrity, insisting she alter Michael's drug test results to paint him as unstable and unfit. What began as a subtle suggestion had evolved into relentless coercion, and Portia could no longer deny that she was being weaponized in Drew's increasingly vengeful campaign. At first, she told herself she was helping Willow reclaim custody, but now the truth was inescapable. This was about control, about destroying Michael to tip the scales of power. Portia's medical license, her career, and even her marriage were at risk, yet Drew's influence crept through every decision she tried to make, poisoning her sense of duty. The pressure mounted with every passing hour. Portia found herself staring at Michael's lab results with shaking hands, the original numbers still safely encrypted but buried beneath the falsified data Drew had pushed her to upload. The internal conflict ate at her. She had sworn to heal, not harm, yet she was now complicit in a lie that could destroy a man's life. Worse, she knew that Drew had no intention of stopping here. If this ploy succeeded, what would come next? Portia could feel the boundaries of her conscience disintegrating, turning her into someone she barely recognized. Her determination hardened not out of loyalty to Drew or fear of exposure, but from a growing resolve to reclaim control. She would not allow herself to become a puppet, no matter how high the stakes. Yet the implications were spiraling. Rumors of Michael's erratic behavior were already circulating, whispered among board members and family friends, fueled by the planted test results. Willow, desperate and emotionally raw, had begun to believe them, creating a rift between her and Michael that seemed irreparable. Portia could see the destruction unfolding in real time. And it terrified her. Dante had started to ask questions. Carly's instincts were on alert. Jason, though distant, had made quiet inquiries that sent shivers down Portia's spine. The lie wasn't just unraveling, it was detonating. And Portia, standing at the center of the storm, knew she had only moments left to decide which side she was truly on. With Drew breathing down her neck and the truth festering just beneath the surface, Portia made a decision. She would confront Drew, not as an accomplice, but as a doctor who had betrayed her oath for too long. She would not allow her name to be etched into the rubble of Michael's downfall. Her resolve to bring the truth into the light grew stronger, even if it meant risking everything. But Drew had anticipated resistance. He reminded her of the digital fingerprints, the altered files, the traces of guilt she'd already left behind. If she turned on him now, he could take her down with him. It was a chilling checkmate that left Portia paralyzed between fear and righteousness. Still, something in her head changed. Maybe it was watching Trina struggle with the fallout of her own deceptions. Maybe it was seeing Curtis slip further away. Or maybe it was simply the crushing weight of knowing she had helped someone ruin another man's life. Whatever it was, Portia was done being silent. She began compiling evidence, screenshots, server access logs, even audio clips from her phone's voice recorder. If she was going down, she would take the whole rotten scheme with her. Because no matter what Drew believed, she would no longer be the one who stayed quiet while innocent lives burned around her. But as Portia took her first steps toward exposing the truth, the consequences accelerated. Michael, now aware that something was off, began a quiet investigation of his own. He reached out to Spinelli, who immediately confirmed that his medical files had been accessed and modified. Willow, shaken and unsure what to believe, confronted Drew, who deflected with cold efficiency. The air in Port Charles had grown electric with suspicion. And Portia knew it was only a matter of time before the dam burst. And when it did, the fallout would be seismic. Families would fracture. Trust would erode. Drew's reputation would be scorched. And Portia's name would be forever linked to a betrayal she could no longer justify. But for the first time in weeks, she felt clarity. She would face the storm. She would answer for her choices. And she would not let Drew rewrite another life just to win a war that had already gone too far. Because no matter how far this had gone, Portia knew one truth above all else: the only way out of darkness was through it. Willow stood at the center of a storm of her own making. Her voice trembling beneath the weight of her justification as she tried to defend what many saw as indefensible, her decision to take Daisy without warning, without permission, and without regard for the chaos it would unleash. She called it protection, claimed it was instinct, that she was shielding the child from a threat no one else seemed to understand. But Port Charles wasn't buying it. Her explanation only poured gasoline on an already blazing fire, and the fallout was swift, severe, and far-reaching. The courtroom of public opinion roared louder than any legal proceeding could, branding her actions not as noble, but as reckless and selfish. What began as a plea for compassion was now being dissected as a sign of emotional instability, a symptom of something darker. Willow's fragile defense did little to pacify the growing unease among those around her, especially as new details surfaced. She hadn't just left town with Daisy, she had avoided court-ordered visitation protocols, disabled her phone, and even ignored Michael's desperate attempts to reach her. Each misstep painted a damning picture, a mother unraveling, making decisions not out of love, but out of desperation and spite. And what made matters worse was the undercurrent of suspicion that Drew had encouraged it all behind the scenes, pulling strings and manipulating circumstances to keep Willow on the offensive. The illusion of control they once clung to had shattered. Those closest to Willow, even those who once supported her through every trauma, began to pull away. Michael, though furious, was more heartbroken than anything else, stunned that the woman he once believed was capable of co-parenting now stood accused of abduction. Carly was silent, her eyes colder than ever, while Jason, though typically composed, began looking into Willow's recent movements with methodical concern. What Willow saw as maternal instinct, the rest of Port Charles saw as a dangerous spiral, and that spiral was starting to pull everything down with it. The implications extended far beyond Daisy. With her mental fitness in question, Willow now faced potential scrutiny over her ability to parent Amelia and Wiley as well. Legal guardianship was suddenly back on the table. And whispers about custody evaluations began to circulate in court-adjacent circles. Lawyers prepared motions. Therapists were called in. And through it all, Willow clung to her narrative, insisting she was right, that Daisy had been in danger, that she had no choice. But the harder she defended herself, the more the cracks in her story began to show. The pressure was relentless. And it began to erode what little stability she had left. Sleep escaped her. Friends vanished. The once gentle, nurturing energy she carried became defensive, sharp, volatile. Even her children sensed the shift. Amelia cried more. Wiley asked questions she couldn't answer. And as Daisy remained in temporary protective custody under court supervision, Willow was forced to confront the possibility that she had not just lost public favor, but her children, too. The thought hollowed her, yet she could not turn back. To admit fault now would be to admit madness, and to admit madness would be to lose everything. In the chaos, Port Charles itself began to tilt. Drew, feeling the walls close in, lashed out at anyone who questioned Willow's motives. Portia, who had once quietly supported Willow, now openly voiced concern about the woman's judgment. Anna began an investigation into possible legal violations surrounding the abduction. Even Sonny, who typically kept his distance from domestic matters like these, was briefed on the situation, especially since it indirectly threatened Michael's custody standing. This wasn't just about one impulsive act anymore. It had become a reckoning. A flashpoint that exposed fractures in relationships, blurred the lines between victim and villain, and turned Willow from a sympathetic figure into a cautionary tale. The community once rallied around her through cancer, loss, and betrayal. But now they wondered if too much had been lost along the way. The trauma that shaped her might now be shaping others in turn, in ways that could never be undone. And yet, deep inside the chaos, Willow remained convinced that she had done the right thing. That conviction, unyielding, unshaken, was either her greatest strength or the final nail in the coffin of her credibility. Port Charles held its breath, waiting to see whether the courts would believe her, whether her children would be returned, and whether she would rise from the wreckage of her choices or be buried beneath them. Jason found himself caught in the eye of a storm he never intended to create. The fragile balance that once defined his bond with Carly had begun to unravel, and now, under the weight of hidden truths and emotional dissonance, it was collapsing entirely. What began as quiet tension had evolved into something far more volatile, a rupture shaped by unspoken resentments, diverging loyalties, and the realization that not everything between them could survive the latest wave of secrets. Jason, usually composed, methodical, and fiercely loyal, was now thrown off-center, emotionally jarred by the shifting ground beneath his feet. The adjustment he had hoped would smooth things over only made matters worse. Carly, increasingly frustrated with the way Jason had handled recent developments, especially the mysterious movements tied to Britt, the encroaching threats from Sidwell, and Jason's refusal to confide in her, saw his silence not as strength but as betrayal. In turn, Jason viewed Carly's insistence on involvement as dangerously impulsive, driven more by emotion than strategy. The push and pull between them, once their greatest strength, was now tearing at every thread of trust. Jason hadn't anticipated how deeply the new strain would affect them, but it was clear that the choices being made on both sides weren't just tactical, they were personal. Carly's growing closeness with others in the Corinthos circle, particularly as she tried to navigate Jocelyn's WSB entanglements, only added fuel to the fire. Jason felt himself drifting, not just from Carly but from the purpose that had always grounded him. And with each attempt to repair the rift, the chasm widened. The fallout reached into every corner of their world. Allies began to take sides, confidences were broken. And even Sonny, already stretched thin from his war with Sidwell, sensed the fracture growing within his most trusted inner circle. Jason, who had spent a lifetime cleaning up other people's messes and shielding those he cared about, now faced the realization that some wounds could not be protected from, not even by him. The adjustment, in truth, was not just in their relationship, but in Jason himself. He no longer operated with the same certainty. Doubt crept in, subtle but corrosive, as he questioned whether his silence had protected Carly or pushed her further away. Whether the decisions he made were born from strategy or from fear of vulnerability. And most disturbingly, whether his connection to Carly had become a liability not just to himself, but to the stability of the entire network they had built around Sonny. The explosion wasn't loud, but it was seismic. Conversations ended before they began. Glances turned cold. Decisions were made in isolation, no longer rooted in partnership. Jason was no longer just fighting enemies on the outside, he was trying to navigate a battlefield within his own heart, where the stakes were just as high. And as Port Charles braced itself for whatever came next, it became painfully clear, the bond between Jason and Carly, once unshakable, was now the most fragile weapon in an increasingly dangerous war. Dante hadn't expected the cold rush of disbelief that swept over him when he witnessed Rocco in deep, almost reverent conversation with Liesl. At first, it was the strangeness of the moment, the subtle intimacy, the way Rocco leaned in, visibly affected, as if the very foundation of his identity were being reshaped in real time. But as Dante stepped closer and caught fragments of the conversation, Britt's name, phrases about birthrights, hidden truths, and stolen choices, his breath caught. This wasn't a casual meeting. This was a revelation in progress, and it was unraveling everything Dante thought he knew about his son. The shock wasn't just in the content. It was in Rocco's expression, haunted, yet strangely alive with understanding. Something in the boy had shifted. Liesl, ever the orchestrator of emotional chaos cloaked in calm rationale, was feeding Rocco a version of his history that Dante and Lulu had buried deep, locked away for his protection. Britt's involvement in Rocco's origins, the ethical lines crossed during the embryo heist, the real nature of the woman who had carried him, all of it was tumbling out, shattering the sanitized version of truth that Dante had always clung to. Dante felt blindsided. Not only by the secret itself, but by how easily Rocco had turned toward Liesl, seeking connection. Seeking answers. It raised a terrifying question in Dante's mind. Had the silence and half-truths from him and Lulu driven Rocco into the arms of someone like Liesl, whose motivations were always layered with personal agenda? And if so, how much damage had already been done? The encounter triggered a cascade of emotional and psychological consequences. Rocco, now teetering on the edge of identity confusion, no longer viewed Dante and Lulu as the sole authors of his life story. Instead, Liesl's narrative, one infused with guilt, grief, and the haunting specter of Britt, was now taking root, pulling Rocco toward a darker, more unstable emotional state. It was a form of inheritance he hadn't asked for, but one he was beginning to claim with growing fervor. Dante knew all too well what this meant. Once Rocco latched onto the idea of Britt not just as a surrogate but as a real mother figure, every parental boundary would blur. The anger, betrayal, and longing would fester. The bond between father and son, once strong despite the cracks, now hung by a thread of unraveling trust. Worse still, Liesl seemed to know exactly what she was doing. Her timing, her tone, the delicate drip of information, all of it suggested this meeting wasn't spontaneous. It was strategic. What made the situation more combustible was the fact that Lulu, still recovering, still emotionally fragile, would be devastated by Rocco's emotional drift. The fragile hope she had clung to, that one day she would reclaim a stronger role in her son's life, was now being undermined in real time. Liesl's involvement was a threat not just to Dante's authority as a father, but to the delicate reconstruction of their fractured family unit. Dante felt the urgency knot in his chest. He couldn't just stand by. This wasn't merely about controlling the narrative anymore, it was about damage control before things spiraled beyond repair. But the damage was already done. Rocco's mind had been touched by a version of the truth that came with pain, mystery, and a pull far more seductive than the guarded reality Dante had tried to preserve. Everything felt like it was about to explode. This interaction, seemingly innocent to the untrained eye, was actually a ticking time bomb. Dante knew that from this moment on, nothing would be the same. Rocco wasn't just asking questions anymore, he was searching for belonging, for connection, for a version of the truth that Dante could no longer control. And Liesl, in all her calculated sympathy, had given him just enough of it to light the fuse.